please.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Andrew. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land we're meeting on, because if we're serious about a sustainable future, it has to be built on reconciliation with the Indigenous Australians. I also want to thank the organisers of this meeting, and I want to thank you for being here rather than doing any one of the 100 other less disturbing and less confronting things you might have been doing this evening. I've been asked to talk about nuclear pathways and their consequences for the environment and civil society. I didn't realise until I got here that this was being videoed, and I'm conscious that the Senate, despite your best efforts, passed a Sedition Act, so I need to be very careful about what I say to make sure I don't offend that Act. So in conclusion, seriously, I want to start with a bit of a historical prologue about how we got into this mess, and then talk about the mess we're in and how we might get out of it. 40 years ago, as a relatively young scientist, like most scientists in my generation, I saw nuclear power as the clean modern alternative to provide the energy that we needed for our future. I'd grown up in New South Wales, and I saw coal miners regularly being killed and injured in that industry. And as a young scientist, I read about the Great London Smog of 1952, where literally hundreds of people died because of the pollution from coal. And I was concerned that we needed energy, because energy was the basis of a civilised lifestyle. The reason we live more comfortably than any previous generation is that energy does for us a lot of the things that previously were done with human muscle power or weren't done at all. And nuclear power looked like a clean, technically attractive alternative. 30 years ago, I was working for the British Open University, and there was a big debate going on in the UK about coal versus nuclear. And they'd been fed the same dishonest line that the Prime Minister is now feeding us, that coal and nuclear are the only alternatives for large quantities of electricity. And there was a vigorous debate about whether they should build coal-fired power stations or nuclear power stations. I was in the energy research group at the British Open University, so we started looking at the issues, and the first thing that we found was that the debate was primarily couched in economic terms, but the economics were so uncertain that it was possible to choose the assumptions you wanted to give the answer that whoever was paying you to provide the analysis wanted. It's a bit like the story of three people who are being interviewed for a job, and they were asked the question at the end of the interview, what's 2 plus 2? And the engineer sort of looked a bit puzzled and said, well, 2 and 2 is 4. And he was thanked for his interest. And the mathematician said, well, that's actually quite a subtle question, because 2 isn't actually 2. It's something between 1.51 and 2.49. So 2 plus 2 is actually something between a bit over 3 and a bit less than 5. I need more information. And the panel thanked him for his full and frank answer, and said that they'd let him know. The third person was a resource economist, and being asked what 2 plus 2 was, looked very furtive, went and locked the door, pulled down the blind and said, what do you want it to be? And it was clear in the debate about the relative economics of nuclear and coal that different people who wanted to advance different views were choosing the assumptions that gave the answer they wanted, because you're not comparing apples with apples. Nuclear power stations cost a lot more to build than coal-fired power stations, but they cost less to run. So whichever looks cheaper depends on what assumptions you make about the relative balance between the capital cost and the running cost. But when we looked more deeply into it, we found that they were really both making the same assumption, which was the sensible thing to do was to build large power stations, nuclear or coal. And that was driven by an economic agenda, which said that if you build bigger power stations, you get economies of scale, so the marginal cost of generating each kilowatt comes down. And indeed, if your system's boundary is the individual power station, that's true. But if you look at the system as a whole, if you have bigger power stations, you need more reserve capacity, and you need a stronger system to cope with the larger units. And when we looked at the figures, the overall cost of generating electricity was actually increased by having big power stations and big power stations remote from where the load was. And it was clear that the whole electrical system would be much better served by a much larger number of smaller units, much closer to where the demand was. And of course, if you have small city centre power stations, as we used to have in Brisbane before Joe abolished the City Council's electricity generating system, you can in principle use the waste heat for process heat or for domestic hot water, whereas if you have large coal-fired power stations or nuclear power stations in the middle of nowhere, you have a large unit of heat which you cannot use and it's simply wasted. So that drew my attention to the fact that the answer you get depends critically on what question you ask, whether it's simply couched in economic terms or whether you look, for example, at the politics. The politics of the nuclear industry at the time were that the Labor Party had come into power by contrasting themselves with the fuddy-duddy grouse-moor image of the Conservatives under Harold Macmillan, "You've never had it so good," sort of thing. And so the Labor Party had embraced nuclear power as characterising the new techno-modern Labor Party. And Harold Wilson talked about the white heat of the technological revolution, which was going to bring the new Britain, the new Jerusalem. And once they started building nuclear power stations, it became apparent that this was changing the pattern of employment and the sort of jobs that were attended on producing electricity. If you mined coal, there were a large number of relatively low-paid and relatively dangerous jobs that were usually held by people who were Labor voters. If you built instead nuclear power stations, there were a quite small number of highly technically advanced, generally well-paid jobs that were generally held by people who weren't Labor voters. And once the Labor Party realised this, they renounced nuclear power with all the zeal of a reformed alcoholic turned temperance campaigner and started running very strong campaigns against nuclear power at about the same time as the Australian Labor Party did. On the other side, the Conservatives, who'd been strongly against nuclear power as some advanced scientific nonsense, realised that the reason the government couldn't fight with the union movement was that coal-fired electricity was vital to the British economy. And when Harold Heath got in a fight with the coal miners in the 1970s, the coal miners won, because they basically said, if you won't give us better paying conditions, we'll stop mining coal. The whole country was put on a 3-day week. He called a snap union bashing election on the slogan, "Who runs Britain, us or the miners?" And the country decided that the miners did because they voted them out and voted in a Labor government who said, "We'll get the mines working again and get the country back on stream." The Conservatives, who have even more of a born-to-rule mentality than the Liberal Party, never forgot that. And when Margaret Thatcher was elected, her crusade was to destroy the union movement in general and the coal mining unions in particular. And the crucial vehicle to doing that was building nuclear power stations so that she could take on the coal miners and starve them out, because Britain no longer needed coal-fired electricity. So it was apparent that the decision about nuclear or coal was not just an economic decision, it was also an intensely political decision. And of course, the nuclear industry was also tied up with the production of nuclear weapons and the UK's so-called independent nuclear deterrent, which, as somebody said, was not very independent and wasn't much of a deterrent, but it was the cornerstone of British defence policy to have their independent nuclear weapons. 30 years ago, I came back to Australia and the Fox report had just been released. Now, you might remember that the Whitlam government set up an inquiry into the proposed uranium mine at Ranger, chaired by Justice Fox. The other two commissioners were Dr. Graham Kelleher and Professor Charles Kerr. And they looked at the proposed uranium mine in the Northern Territory, and they said that it was clear that uranium could be mined and sold and would generate a modest amount of export income, nothing very wonderful, but a modest number of jobs and a modest export income. But that inquiry turned into a more wide-ranging study of the nuclear fuel cycle and Australia's role in it. And the Fox report also said that the mining and export of uranium was associated with two problems that were certainly not solved at the time and appeared possibly intractable. The problems of radioactive waste, which is inevitably produced if you use nuclear power and has to be stored safely for hundreds of thousands of years, and the problem that fissile material can be used to produce nuclear weapons. And the Fox report said until those problems are solved, it's not really responsible to mine and export uranium and contribute more to problems that look to be very difficult ones for human society. And I found that argument very persuasive and turned almost overnight from being cautiously and gently in favour of a limited role for nuclear power to being quite militantly opposed to mining and exporting uranium in the absence of solutions to those problems. At the time, of course, we were told that nuclear power was cheap, clean and safe, but within 10 years we had 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, and the economics was looking increasingly dodgy, so it became clear that nuclear power was not cheap, it wasn't clean, and it wasn't safe. And as a result, there had been a slow decline in the amount of nuclear energy used around the world from a peak about 1990. As economic markets were liberalised, investors abandoned nuclear power. Margaret Thatcher brought in non-fossil fuel obligation to try and prop up the nuclear industry, requiring the electricity authorities to sell a certain percentage of electricity that didn't come from fossil fuels. And what it did was stimulate the renewable energy industry and wind power in particular, because that was a much more cost-effective way of meeting the non-fossil fuel obligation than building nuclear power stations. And 10 years ago, it looked like the nuclear industry was in terminal decline. No new power stations had been built in the United States since the mid-1970s. A small number, a handful, had been ordered in Western Europe, and we were doing what we traditionally did with industries that are no longer seen as acceptable in the developed world. We were trying to persuade developing countries to embrace these wonderful technologies that we knew weren't acceptable. What's happened in the last few years? Well, about 4 years ago, people in the nuclear industry, who'd never shown any sign of being interested in climate change, suddenly realised that this was their last chance to salvage the nuclear industry. And there's been analysis now of the quite clever campaign that started in the UK of briefing journalists in key organs of mass media about the possible role that nuclear power could play as part of a balanced portfolio along with renewables and gas and other forms of energy to solve this pressing problem of climate change. And the mass media took this up. I mean, the Murdoch press until quite recently was saying that simultaneously that climate change is not a proven problem, but it's so serious that we should embrace nuclear power, which is a very interesting dual position to be handling simultaneously. And in recent years, we've seen quite reputable environmentalists like James Lovelock and Tim Flannery say that the impact of climate change is so serious, we should be prepared to consider nuclear power as part of the solution. And more recently, of course, John Howard returned from a briefing in Washington and suddenly announced that nuclear power was part of Australia's future, and is now running the line, as he did in Parliament yesterday, that nuclear and coal are really the only alternatives if we don't want to freeze to death in the dark. A barefaced lie, but I don't suppose we should be surprised with that, because the man's got form in that area. So what's going on? I mean, what is incontrovertible, I think, is that climate science is saying that we have a serious problem. 20 years ago, before the year I was at the Commission for the Future, I was involved with the first big national conference on climate change, Greenhouse 87, at which the climate scientists were setting out what we knew then. And it was clear 20 years ago that human activity was changing the composition of the atmosphere. By then there was 30 years of good data showing that. And it was also clear that the climate was changing. The Earth was getting warmer, and there seemed some evidence that sea level was rising and that patterns of rainfall might be changing. But most cautious scientists were saying it's too early to say that these are linked. And that's a very important issue, to know whether two things that are happening at the same time have a causal link, or they are just coincidental. If you think about it, most dishonest political rhetoric is based around inferring a causal link where none exists. You know, since we have been elected, these good things have happened, or since that other lot have been elected, these bad things have happened, even if it has nothing to do with them. The story that best illustrates this was told by Anthony Tucker in The Guardian about a statistician from the University of London who concluded after a tour of London strip clubs that sitting in strip clubs made men go bald. I'm sorry for the follically challenged, but apparently the observational basis is unarguable that the men sitting in London strip clubs on average have significantly less hair than the population average. What's clearly a fallacy, if you'll pardon the expression, is the inference that sitting in the strip club has made men lose their hair. And it would be equally spurious to suggest the opposite causality, that the sight of bald-headed men makes women take their clothes off. There's clearly a relationship between the nature of the performance and the nature of the audience, but it's not a simple cause-effect one. And in 1987, the scientists were saying, these things are happening, but it's too early to say that there's a cause-effect link. What I thought it was reasonable to say in 1988, and caused me to write the first Australian paperback book on climate change in 1989, Living in the Greenhouse, was that there were a lot of things we could do to reduce our assault on the planetary atmosphere that would not be economically damaging. In fact, they would actually save money, as well as reducing what we were doing to the atmosphere. And this was probably a sensible precautionary thing to do. At the time, the lack of certainty was seen as an excuse for inaction, and I found that very puzzling. It was a bit like if you were driving along a road you don't know, and your headlights were fading. Not many people would say, well, we can't see, so we've got to put our foot down. Any reasonable person would say, if you're not certain what's ahead, you should be more cautious, you should go more slowly. But what we essentially did 20 years ago was to say, we're not sure what will happen if we keep putting carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere, but let's do it anyway and find out. You know, we've essentially conducted a very large-scale experiment on the planetary atmosphere. 10 years ago, the scientific jury was back in, and the atmospheric scientists were saying, almost as one person, we can now see a causal link between what we're doing to the atmosphere and the climate change that we're observing, and we are now much more confident that we are seeing both changes in temperature, changes in rainfall patterns, increasing sea level, more frequent extreme events, and so on. And by now, there is really no serious questioning, although there's a fair bit of non-serious questioning that we get in the Courier Mail and other journals of scientific repute. A retired marine geologist from James Cook University are prepared to say that science is not yet convinced. But it's important to recognise that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which draws together the work around the world of about 6,000 climate scientists, is not sort of some outlandish extreme point of the scientific debate. What it represents is the cautious, conservative, lowest common denominator of scientific opinion. And the fourth assessment report, which has just been released, had edited out of it any statement that the most conservative scientists could say isn't yet entirely 100% backed up by scientific evidence. So when the IPCC say we can expect the temperature to increase this century by between 2 and 6 degrees, that is as good an estimate as you can get from the scientific community. There is, for example, nothing in the report about the concern that most climate scientists have that we still remain cosmically ignorant about the complexity of natural systems, and that there's a real risk that we could push the planetary climate system past some critical threshold that will precipitate a very large change to a situation that would be much less pleasant for human occupation, whether it's stopping the circulation of the North Atlantic, or releasing methane from the Arctic tundra, or causing the Amazon forest to burn much more often and put carbon dioxide into the air. There are about 8 of those really bad events that could happen, and there aren't very many really good events that could happen to make life better than that. And that's why everywhere around the world, decision makers, with 2 notable exceptions, are agreed now that we should be doing something about climate change. We, of course, are part of the coalition of the unwilling, sort of axis of environmental irresponsibility with the United States of America, that hasn't ratified Kyoto and hasn't yet done anything serious to respond to climate change. But the public is now much more aware of the issue. I saw an opinion poll today, for example, in which people were asked, is Australia's climate policy a sham? Yes, 90%, no, 10%. In other words, people now accept that what we're getting is all smoke and mirrors. Malcolm Turnbull changing a few light bulbs isn't going to solve the problem. We really need to think in a much more concerted and urgent way about what we're doing. The science says that globally we need to reduce the amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases we're putting into the atmosphere by at least 60% by the middle of this century. And if that's going to be done in a way that allows people in the poorest parts of the world to achieve quite legitimate development aspirations like clean drinking water and having one light bulb, probably what will be seen as reasonable for Australia is rather more than that, more like an 80% reduction in the next 50 years. And faced with that quite large change in what we're doing, what people like John Howard tell us is that it's physically impossible, and that if it were possible it would be economically damaging, and therefore there's no alternative but to consider nuclear as part of the solution. So let me unpack these issues of whether it's physically possible to dramatically reduce our carbon dioxide emissions, whether it would be economically damaging, and whether there's any real reason to consider nuclear as part of the mix. In terms of our energy needs, the first and most fundamental point is that we could live just as well as we now do using much less energy. Because if you think about it, people don't want energy. I've never heard anyone say, oh, I've got to go and get some megajoules. What Amory Lovins used to say is people don't want energy, they want hot showers and cold beer. They want the ability, as someone unfortunately said, to cook their clothes and wash their food. What we want is the ability to do things with energy, to see in the dark, to move around, to keep our beer cold and so on. And there are serious studies like that by the Wuppertal Institute in Germany which have concluded that we can have all of the energy related services we now have, and we can continue to do stupid things like fuel cars and driving around in circles just to see which one can go the fastest. We can do all of the energy using things we now do in the developed countries using a quarter of the energy that we now use. And there's any number of case studies showing how you can dramatically reduce the energy needed for a given task. The redevelopment of the Reichstag building, for example, the redeveloped building uses 6% of the energy that the old building used to achieve exactly the same task. I've been in houses in Canberra that use no heating whatsoever, just the waste heat from appliances and solar gain, to stay at a temperature of 19 degrees when it's -12 outside, just by good design. The point is that we could use much less energy and still have the same quality of life. As a particular example, here in the Sunshine State, only about 6% of us use solar hot water. That's a lower percentage than in the ACT. If half of the households in Queensland used solar hot water, that would save more electricity than a nuclear power station would generate. And what we care about is services like hot water, not the technology that produces them. So the first and most urgent task, I believe, in responding to climate change is to look at ways of turning energy more efficiently into the services that we want. In terms of the other big use of energy, which is for transport, I think the key issue is urban planning, which focuses on accessibility rather than mobility. If you think about it, people don't come to cities so they can drive around or sit in traffic jams going nowhere. They come to cities for the services that cities provide. And I believe the planning task is to put more of the services that we use frequently within easy distance so that we can walk or cycle to them, and fewer of the services that we use regularly so far away that the only alternative is to drive to get there. We could do much more with cycling, for example. We still regard cycling as a transport technology for young people until they can graduate to something more dangerous. But there are quite civilised cities in Western Europe where between 30 and 40% of all urban journeys are made by bicycle. And the bicycle actually uses about 1/50th of the energy of a car per person kilometre, and it's usually renewable energy like wheat bix rather than non-renewable energy like oil. So we'd actually be a lot healthier, as well as have cities that are a lot less polluted, if we did more to encourage people to cycle and use public transport. Just one case study of what can be done about making the shift from a car-based city to a public transport city. When Ken Livingstone became Lord Mayor of London a couple of years ago, he was concerned about the fact that the city was getting increasingly congested. The public transport system was getting increasingly run down, so more people were choosing to drive, so the streets were getting more congested. People kept talking about stupid solutions like building tunnels or building bridges, but he was smart enough to realise that that doesn't solve the problem. All a tunnel does is move the traffic jam from one place to another, and he decided something had to be done to provide carrots and sticks and change the way people were getting around London. So he brought in a congestion tax. The basic deal was that if you drove your car into the central area of London, you paid a charge which started out at £5. That's about $12, not a trivial charge at all. And this money was going into a dedicated fund to improve public transport. I was back in London about 6 months after this was brought in, and despite the concern that this would lead to the death of the city because nobody would drive into it anymore, in fact there were more people shopping and recreating in the city because the streets were much more pleasant to be in, they were much less congested, much less polluted, and money was coming in to enhance public transport. In fact, after 12 months, by public demand, he increased the charge from £5 to £8, which is about $20, and I was told yesterday that he's going to increase it next year to £12, which is about $30, because people are saying, yes, it's working, but it's not doing enough fast enough to improve public transport and provide us with the alternatives. So he's broken through the logjam, the despair in the city where it gets more and more congested, there's less and less incentive to use public transport. He's turned it around just with one stroke. So we can do things that dramatically change how much energy we need. Second issue, physically impossible to use anything but coal or nuclear. The amount of wind power around the world is now about 45,000 megawatts, about the same as the total installed electrical capacity of Australia. And in the last decade, the amount of wind power installed around the world has been increasing at an average rate of 30% per annum. In the same period, the amount of solar power has been increasing at about 20% per annum. The amount of coal-fired power has been increasing at 1% per annum. The amount of nuclear power has been increasing at 0.6% per annum. So as usual, Mr. Howard has his finger right on the pulse in saying it has to be coal or nuclear. That's obviously the decision that the rest of the world has made. In terms of the argument that it can't possibly be scaled up to meet the huge energy demands of a modern industrial society, Denmark now gets 20% of its electricity from wind alone and is committed to increasing that to 50% by 2015. Renewables together, wind, solar, geothermal, biomass, now account for a quarter of the installed capacity of California, which if it were a separate country would be the third or fourth largest consumer of electricity in the world. Renewables account for a third of Sweden's energy, half of Norway's, 3/4 of Iceland's, and Iceland actually has a policy of being totally powered by renewable energy by 2020. They made that decision in 1999, and I remember at the time New Scientist wrote it up and said Iceland had obvious advantages in making this sort of radical step to move away from fossil fuels to a renewable economy. So Iceland is an island community, so their transport system doesn't interface with anyone else, so they can go their own way. They have a good base in science and technology, and they have a relatively small population per unit land area, so that they have good resources of renewable energy. And I said to a conference, it's a pity we didn't have those sorts of advantages in Australia. We might have been able to do something similar. Of course, we have all those advantages. What we don't have, and Iceland has, is politicians looking 20 years ahead and making visionary decisions to get ahead of the game rather than playing catch-up. In terms of what we can do in Australia, 15 years ago, the Commonwealth Department of Resources and Energy released a report, Renewable Electricity for Australia, based on the research and development done by the National Energy Research Council when I was a member of it in the 1980s. That report concluded 15 years ago that we could get 30% of our electricity from renewables by 2020 at no more than 10% extra cost. If you think about it, the government gave us the 10% extra cost, they call it the GST, they didn't give us the 30% renewables. In fact, we're getting a smaller percentage of our electricity from renewables today than we were when John Howard took office. The same report said that we could get all of our electricity from renewables by 2030 for probably about 50% more than continuing to burn coal. It's technically feasible to have a mix of renewables that provide all of the electricity you need. It would just cost a bit more than burning coal and changing the global climate. So is the obstacle economic? Well, in one sense it is, because in the short term it costs more to use clean energy like wind or solar or biomass or geothermal. But in the long term it's going to cost us a mozza if we keep changing the global climate. And that was the point of the Stern report released last year in the UK, that the likely cost of climate change is at least a factor of 10 greater than the most outlandish estimate of what it would cost to respond and put less carbon dioxide in the air and slow down the rate of climate change. If you think of what we pay in Australia, we're probably paying about $1,000 million this year in costs of climate change, in reduced agricultural production, in the increased cost of water supply, in the increased cost of extreme events like tropical cyclones and severe bushfires, and we're at the same time spending about $6 billion a year subsidising fossil fuel supply and use to make the problem worse, which doesn't seem to be very rational public policy. In terms of what it would cost us to respond to dramatically reduce our emissions, the Business Leaders Roundtable last year, which was made up of the CEOs of Westpac and BP and Origin Energy and 3 other quite large companies, commissioned economic modelling from Allens Consulting. And Allens Consulting took the base case, the ABARE John Howard model of exponentially increasing emissions, world without end, amen, in which our emissions by 2050 are 85% greater than the baseline. And they compared it with an aggressive policy of getting our emissions down to 60% below the baseline by 2050. And they found that it makes about 6 months difference to achieving the economic production that we will achieve on the 1st of January 2050. In other words, if we aggressively reduce emissions to 60% below the baseline rather than 85% above, the total economic output that we now expect on economic models to achieve on the 1st of January 2050 will be delayed till sometime in July that year. In other words, there is essentially no significant economic difference between a model in which we act now and act purposefully in a concerted way to reduce our emissions and one in which we do nothing about the problem. So really the economic argument of John Howard, I'm not going to cut emissions 60% because that would devastate the economy and put thousands of people out of work. It is economically illiterate as well as ecologically illiterate. Do we need nuclear? Well, that is, as I said, just a lie. Even if we needed big power stations, nuclear power is too costly, too slow, makes too little difference, and is too dangerous both environmentally and socially. And in the last few minutes, I want to unpack that a bit and say why I think that nuclear power shouldn't be an option. There are a range of renewable technologies like wind, bio-wastes, solar thermal, certainly solar domestic hot water, probably geothermal, that cost less in terms of delivered energy than nuclear power. Nuclear power operating today around the world. If you look at the nuclear industry, in the 50 years from 1947 to 1999, the subsidies to the nuclear industry in the US alone, direct subsidies were $115 billion. The indirect subsidies were another $145 billion. Total subsidies to the nuclear industry in the US over that period, $260 billion. In the same period, the total subsidies to wind and solar were about $5 billion. That's wind and solar together. The point is that if you look at the Svitkowski report, which was put together by a group that are avowedly pro-nuclear, and Ziggy was rewarded by being made chairman of the Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation almost before the ink was dry on the report, they said that the most optimistic view is that nuclear might be 20% more expensive, but if you look at the fine print, that assumed large public subsidies. If you assumed that we bought nuclear power off the shelf, it would cost about 50% more. 50% more, where have I heard that figure before? That's what it would cost to get 100% of our electricity for renewables. So there's absolutely no case on economic grounds to go with nuclear. Too slow. The Svitkowski report said the most optimistic view is that if we decided now to build a nuclear power station, it would take 15 years to have one nuclear power station operating. 20 years for it to be a positive in energy terms because of the amount of energy needed to build the nuclear power station and fuel it and mine the uranium and get the thing started up. Their gung-ho nuclear future, in which we build 25 nuclear reactors, would only decrease the growth in our greenhouse gas emissions by 2050 by 18%. In other words, the nuclear solution is not only too expensive and too slow, it makes too little difference.